Thank you, Kristen. We'll begin with questions from the youngest person in the room. If you need a microphone, we have one and I'll deliver it, yes. I think we go.
Hi, I'm Rowan, class of 2014. I actually got my master's in poli-sci public affairs a couple years back. So I'm also the product of state workers in Sacramento. Both of my parents started off as entry-level state workers, worked their way up. I don't think state workers in Sacramento were unified until 2010, 2011, maybe earlier than that, when Schwarzenegger wanted to reduce their salary schedule to minimum wage. I like this lecture a lot because you're pointing out a lot of the abuses of power from both Democratic and Republican Party platforms and the rhetoric that they use. My only question is do you think that rhetorical, that rhetoric not only has the power to abuse power in political parties, but do you also think that rhetoric can also change politics itself in terms of different aspects of politics? It could change an agenda, policy agenda, and stuff like that. And I know you showed that it has in some aspects, but moving forward, is rhetoric a powerful tool to frame those questions that we can address?
That's a big question, and I do think that it has the power for change. I think, it's a slow change. It's not quick, and part of what's slow is how those metaphors change, right? So we saw kind of the evolution from this just straight business to its nuanced form with the gamification, right? And maybe drawing on more corrupt elements of the business. There is a potential for ethical business models too, right? But that's not what's being drawn upon always by some of our leaders. So I think figuring out those opportunities is where rhetorical analysis is useful to us, right? Figuring out what values resonate with audiences, how we can actually find that middle ground when arguments seem entrenched. I think that's where rhetoric gives us a way forward in terms of rhetoric as a technique. But I also see, humans are involved, so a lot of mistakes get made, and it is messy, and there are so many missing pieces. So, yes, a hesitant yes. I think rhetoric is the way democracy happens, and democracy happens very slowly sometimes, and getting to better decisions happens slowly. So if we reinvigorate democracy at a local level through local discussions and deliberations, if we reinvigorate locally, I think we have a potential to better scale it up. And it's kind of a lot bigger discussion than right here. But I will also disclose, I'm somewhat a product of unions as well. My father was in the teachers union as I grew up. I was studying unions before I met my husband, but he is also a member of a union, so I do directly benefit from negotiations that unions do. So obviously I have a vested interest in them, but I'm also interested in why people are persuaded by anti-union arguments. I think it's really wrong to dismiss that element, even if we disagree with it, because it is impactful. And if we're going to make change, we have to understand the opposition and respect how those decisions are made. So.
Yeah, I was wondering, so as in certain roles that you have in life, like I'm a lawyer, so I think especially about the words that I use when I'm writing them down. And then you really analyzed the words that people were using, and I don't know if they were written down, or I don't know how much these tweets are, actually thought about. I was wondering, like if I was going to write a tweet and put it out in the public, and I wasn't a lawyer, or maybe if it was someone of significance, I would have someone write them for me and double check it and think about it. How do you think that they have writers, or do you think that they're not really thinking about it, or you think they're just like putting it out there without thinking, or re-looking at their work because you're analyzing them once they're said? So I was just wondering how much thought you think they're putting into it versus they're saying it and you're analyzing it after?
Right, so intention is a big point of contention in rhetorical studies, because how do we know the intent of the speaker? And in a lot of ways, that while of interest, especially of ethical interest to us, I don't know how important it is in a practical sense, right? Because once these enter the public argument, and once we are hearing them and building upon them, that intent gets sometimes overridden by interpretation and whatnot. So I'm not so concerned by who wrote them, but I will share with you here that I was trying to think through this whole game element of the metaphor, and that still needs a little bit more development, because I know it's at play, I see it happening. I haven't figured out who represents every what piece, and I was thinking, oh, the leader is chess master. Oh, no, that's not it. I was thinking this is more like checkers happening, right? And possibly checkers by like grandpa teaching my kids to play, where a lot of cheating is going on and a lot of manipulation of pieces is happening potentially. There is intention involved and an end is expected, but the rules get a little messy when grandpa's teaching, right? Maybe not a benevolent or nice grandpa either. It's not fully worked out, but that's what discussion is for. That's why we talk about these things.
Why do you think the argument for running government as a business has been so successful, particularly because so many of the functions of government, whether it's public education or public transit or public safety, are inherently money-losing enterprises that are meant to give a benefit to all of the community. So there seems to be a missing link between the fact that if these public agencies were businesses, they would be out of business because they're not meant to be profit centers.
Which is why a lot of those programs have been cut or undermined even further and made less effective in the last few years. Right, but I think you're raising the question, what's so persuasive about this business model and why has it persisted? Especially to those who it's not in their interest. And I think there's a few things at play. After the recession, a lot of people were hurting financially, but we still have this American dream that through hard work we can make it and achieve too. And I think by talking to citizens, taxpayers, as shareholders, and you're going to get some benefit out of what our government is doing, as if you were a business leader, not the grunt that works 9 to 5, which most people are, right? That is allowing people to imagine themselves achieving the American dream in a lot of ways. So we see that potential for casting ourselves in that role of the business leader in some ways. But I think that's where people who are defending public programs and defending different visions of government need to work to shift our focus from how we conceptualize benefits from government, which I tried to get into a little bit here. And shifting that focus then might open the door for eventually reintroducing or creating a new worldview or perspective that isn't necessarily business-centered for viewing our relationship with government. But I don't see that happening overnight, and that's where I think that gradual nature is. And perhaps it will take another major event to provide a big enough exigency for something new to enter our public discourse. And it's just a speculation now.
Ernest, you don't need this.
No, I don't. Excellent lecture. Thank you very much. I want to go back to one of the quotes by Michael Moore about essentially government being bought and paid for by corporate America. Rhetorically, what do you think that says about the choice of voters?
Might be values.
The validity of American elections. Isn't that rhetorically call into question the validity of American elections, such that Mr. Moore rhetorically is suggesting that normal Americans don't know their own minds and they can be bought.
And I think he says we screwed up there too, right? Like we allowed this to happen, but the only way to change our error is to actively participate and act collectively to amass that power. So yeah, I think he definitely says we as citizens, we dropped the ball. And in this essence, he's saying we thought too individualistically, we need to think more communally again. Right? And that argument is supported by the fact there's thousands of people standing with him out there in freezing temperatures, right? And they're enacting that shift in participation perspective that he's saying is the solution to that surrender, that previous surrender.
Would you agree, though, I'm following up, that I think Ernie would say this, and you made an answer that I don't think he heard. Moore is devaluing the voting public when he says the election was bought and paid for. Didn't you say you agreed?
No.
Ernie, am I not getting it?
That's what I think what Michael Moore is saying.
Yes.
Is that since the only way that the corporate money, he says corporate money controls, the only way the corporate money can control is that they are able to persuade people to elect Scott Walker, who was elected, as I recall, 3 times in 4 years.
Yeah, so I think that there's a time element to that the argument Moore is making, right? So it's this is what has happened, and it will continue to happen if we don't act collectively to counter that influence of money. So I think he's saying there is hope. But yes, that is certainly what has been done before. The voting public can only be reinvigorated if they act collectively as they are in their protest actions. But that has to be carried to the polls. Otherwise, by being lazy, we allow people to buy us off. And I think it's implicitly, and there is an argument for more critical reasoning, critical voting by the electorate too.
I am wondering, because the foundations of people's campaigns are so funded by the wealthy, the people that rise to the top are the ones that are bought by the wealthy, not necessarily the voters who are possibly choosing between the options that they see in front of them, which are made more visible by the purchasing. Does that make sense? Do you think that it automatically devalues the voters themselves, or does it just kind of degrade the democratic process a little bit, but leaves voters choosing between the options they're given?
Maybe a little bit of both, if I'm understanding you correctly. Because I think there is an element where more money means more visibility of an argument and of the candidate, right? So that's part of an issue that I don't think Moore gets into. He kind of simplifies some of this, and part of that's for his audience and the constraints of being outside of frigid temperatures. They're not thinking too hard in the moment. This is pre-planned. But then there's the element of, sorry, I'm losing my train of thought too. So we have on the big level, yes, more money takes away from the vote because it limits who and what arguments get heard. But I think it's both, because who's speaking and to whom are they speaking? Does money allow a politician access to more citizens? And through mailers, the answer is yes, certainly. And through more TV spots, certainly. Or is it just that they're loud, Their argument, they know they will have some help along the way to get more financial resources. I don't know 100% to your question. Money's messy.
Thank you again for your presentation. You seem to indicate, and maybe I hope I'm not misreading it, that this, with Moore and some of the others, it was a step. They screwed up, but maybe in the future they'll get coalesced, they'll do better, and so that there's somewhere in the horizon for the average voter. Again, I hope I'm not misreading it, My question though is, this rhetorical statement, both either by Walker or by Moore, they've been around for a long, long time. I mean, La Follette, what is it, Wisconsin, was one of, back in the 30s, was going ahead and talking about power to the people. I mean, he didn't use those words in that phrase. Back in the 50s, the whole thing about unions and some of the problems that were going on with that, the strikes, this whole idea of corporate America running all the politicians and elections and all of that other, that's been recycled time and time again. So it seems to me that the rhetorical methodology of Walker and with Moore comes down to simply this: how much power can I get by going ahead and coalescing my people against their people? It seems to me it's the same argument dressed up at different times. Or am I missing something?
To a degree, certainly. And these arguments come again, but they are to the specific time. And I think that's part of the nature of democracy, right? Each generation coming up has to reclaim, rededicate, but they don't do it in a vacuum. We don't start from scratch each time we face a similar crisis or issue or exigency. So we draw on rhetorical forms that we're familiar with. We draw on historical elements of the historical narrative that we are familiar with. Maybe we retell that narrative in a different way to serve our ends. I mean, Aristotle was theorizing about the techniques of rhetoric a couple thousand years ago, and they're still used today. So I'm not quite sure what the exact issue is, other than I think it is useful for us to think about how minute changes take place in public discourse, where there are true opportunities and maybe where there aren't, right? Because policies do change. Women can vote now, right? Like, something really did happen through speech and through action. And, you know, union rules do change, and the laws that get passed create new challenges for the future, new voices who can speak and who can't speak, and new challenges, even if we do bring up the same topoi and do have the same lines of reasoning.
In the reading, Bitzer talks about Winston Churchill going around looking for rhetorical situations. It seems to me that media, I mean, there's no discussion of modern media. That's certainly a way of helping you find, or as sophists do, create rhetorical situations or seeming situations. And so it would seem to me that wealth would be very fundamental to that. And so that's maybe a more serious way of saying what Michael Moore said, that elections are bought. I mean, it's much more complicated than that. And Democrats often complain that if everybody voted, and very few people vote, if everybody voted, the Democrats would win. And so another way of phrasing that is you need the rhetoric and the rhetorical access, the media access, to bring that off. And so wealth really does, with modern media, affect your access to a rhetorical situation.
Was that a question?
I don't know, I got a comment.
Good comments.
I have a question, if there's a comment. In this digital age now, where things like Twitter and people getting their information from their cell phones in little snippets, the deterioration of the nation's newspapers, the increasingly sensationalism in the media, is all this innervating the power of rhetoric in our society?
I think it's shifting how we think about rhetoric in a lot of ways. And I think that's where public argument is useful, and looking at kind of the trends and enthymemes present. Because a tweet, the shorter we speak, the more we rely on an audience to fill in. And so as a rhetorical scholar, how do we go about figuring out what audiences are capable of filling in, what they aren't? How can speakers strategically respond to situations with, I mean, in some ways it calls for knowing your audience better, right? To send out the message that's going to be interpreted in the way you want it to. So it certainly can invigorate rhetorical studies. The practice of rhetoric, though, and I think this goes back to our issues of citizenship and wealth and voting, we have to have an educated citizenry, right? That's capable of making informed decisions. And how do we do that? Other than making everyone do integral and open minds, right? And I think that's where local discussion, local conversations, the face-to-face is really important. And I think rhetoric, when we scale up democracies, faces new challenges and presents a lot more of those dangers of rhetoric. Rhetoric can easily be used as a weapon or a tool for harm. And we can see those consequences on a much larger scale when we scale up democracy too. Just kind of bouncing around ideas from your question.
Hey, I have something to say that maybe plays off some of that. It is fascinating to me the idea, or to think of the ways in which argument is constrained, like you mentioned. And for me, it comes into play just considering the political parties. And you talk about, political arguments in particular are constrained, seems to me, by these party lines. And this is moving, it used to be that it wasn't so constrained. And so the politicians need to abide by the party lines in order to get reelected. So I guess, to me, it seems like there's almost two public discourses. If you have a rhetorical situation, there's one in one party and one in the other, but, in order to get these everyday people involved in this, how do you get them talking to each other again when it's so, it seems like those people, many of them have, on both sides, have their identity very tightly intertwined with their party. So I guess that's the thing that fascinates me, is this idea of, how do you get in there rhetorically and get these people talking to each other, and what do we need to do? It seems like this happens on both sides, and it seems to me like this is a large problem.
It is. I can tell you on the ground, there's been some really interesting work done. I had the honor to work with John Gaskell at Penn State. He's more social science end, but interested in democratic participation and citizenship, and has done a lot with citizen initiatives and bringing together public discussions and then publishing those conversations and arguments in voting guides, and how that can reinvigorate participation and thoughtfulness about some of these issues. So I know there are initiatives on the ground to actually implement ideas, obviously not on a large scale at this point, but there certainly is work being done to try to address some of those issues. And I think there is definitely a place for us to theorize about it and us to do something about it. Put those together.
I agree with that. I just want to tell a little very brief anecdote that gets to my question. So I was at a party with a guy who's married to one of my cousins, and he got to talking about public employees and how they get so much benefits, including pensions. And it took me a minute to remember that he had lost absolutely everything in a company he had invested himself in Silicon Valley, and he went broke. It was clear that he was looking at me once I said, well, I'm afraid I got one of those CalPERS pensions. You don't compete in the same competitive world I do. you have this sort of guaranteed, you got a GS rating if you don't commit rape, murder, you keep rising. The kind of security was his concern, and it seemed to me that the politics of resentment, which is death to democracy, is one we're drifting to, and that's what I tend to look back at, kind of a golden age when you're creating a kind of middling condition for everybody, in which everybody got a piece of the pie enough to prevent that natural tendency from occurring. And that's my sense of the situation that we're in, and that we have to find remedies for it. But your view is the remedies have to come from rhetorical activity itself, rather than being, say, technologically.
Maybe perhaps of both, right? So right now, one of the things we hear with Trump is a lot of the supporters, it wasn't a matter of, I'm going to get something out of this, but I'm going to make other people suffer as much as I have, right? And that attitude has to be changed in the way we talk, as well as in how we act. Because the only way we're going to be able to implement those technological solutions that will bring everybody up is through speech, right? To get people to buy into them. And how do we do that? We have to switch away from that politics of fear and resentment. And we saw those reflected in the speeches I was looking at today, for sure. I mean, Walker, I didn't even go into what he did about Wisconsin versus Illinois, but it's all politics of fear and creating this idea of resentment, right? And how do we shift it from you have it so good, you need to do more and suffer more, to, how can I get it as good as you in my area, right? And one of those answers that they might not like is maybe there's an opportunity for private sector unions to start helping private sector workers get better compensation and protection, and to perhaps maybe the business owners don't have as significant of profits, but perhaps the whole standard of living could go up. And, we had kind of a breaking point sort of in the progressive era where there was so extensive suffering that something had to change, and that's when protections happened. And sadly, it looks like we have to hit those sorts of levels for changes to be entertained again. But yeah, I definitely hear what you're saying.
So one question I have is on your second question that you have, how do the leaders describe their roles impacting citizenship? I've noticed in a trend when looking at the Democratic and Republican parties that we even have a further shift of how leaders are describing themselves now. With Republicans, you obviously have businessmen that are rising to the top, but then on the left, on the liberal side, we see more community activists, almost people that disperse or want to move away from the public sector, people that have come from traditionally entrenched democratic positions and almost askew and look unfavorably towards that. So do you see that kind of adjustments of the way these leaders have described themselves as community activists and not necessarily people that are in bed with traditional unions being a potential problem? Because we're seeing a pretty clear schism within the Democrats right now with the new portals of being able to raise money, AKA Bernie Sanders, Biden versus a few of the other new candidates that are coming up, and just the changing the way that the rhetoric's being said.
Right, and that's a really interesting one, and I think, again, it's a very dynamic area because we're finding, oh, look, Democrats like money too, right? You need it it's almost a pay-to-play situation in a lot of ways, but at the same time, how do we keep those values espoused by that community activism? And I think it also gets at what point does grassroots activism become institutionalized if we demonized institutionalizing things, like when social movement values get adopted into policy, well then now it's no longer really activism, right? You can use the normal channels. And I think a lot of those entering through community activism lines have to really work on how they construct their own narratives to be able to continue to operate once they have that institutional power, and acknowledging that that situation has totally changed for them, right? Yes, it is power to the people, but look, now we have access to actually make those changes that we protested for happen, right? Does that get at what you're?
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm getting at.
Okay.
It's that kind of, that almost, the underdog becoming institutionalized and that realization and not changing of rhetoric to that problem.
Right, and I will also say a lot of my background is in social movement studies from a sociological perspective. So I'm very cognizant of these sort of institutional process, formal elements that are having impacts in addition to rhetoric, and how organization itself, structures, bureaucracies and whatnot, constrain arguments too. So I am aware of these pieces. It's not rhetoric floating alone in the world. But yeah, there's definitely some rapids ahead to be navigated.
So when my grandmother came over from Ireland in the early 1900s, she made sure after she got married that all her sons and daughters got public service jobs. That was their safety net. That was, to work as a policeman or as a fireman. So I find that ironic that now it's kind of like they're being thrown to the dogs as the enemy du jour. It's those public service workers sucking at the teat of America or something. And in fact, they're the same people. And they're just collecting what they were promised. And should we throw it back into the kitty? I don't know.
That's certainly problematic.
Can I see any other hands, any other questions?
These students with questions. Doesn't have to follow from where we are in this point in the conversation if something's been bugging you all along.
Excuse me.
So from what I understood about what you were saying between the Moore and Walker debate, when they were having the discussion over whether or not to change the power of the unions within the state, what brought, I understand that there were thousands of workers in the snow protesting the changes, but what brought them to actually foster the change in discussion? Similarly, in the 2018-2019 discussion between the Republicans and Democrats over the funding for the American workers and for the government, what brought the discussion to bear? Was it a sense of community or was it a sense of individualism? And how did rhetoric play in that?
Yeah, I think it is a little bit of both were appealed to. So I think that because Wisconsin had a fairly large public sector employee thing, there is a communal element that brought the numbers there. And a lot of people, I was at Penn State at the time and there were solidarity protests on campus. Wisconsin had solidarity protests everywhere. I was at a state college, so our professors are public employees and in a way too. And you could see the writing on the wall, what's happening in Wisconsin spreading around. And I think that communal awareness that my individual safety and security and financial stability are on the line down the road is certainly there, but also I have a lot in common with those people and therefore I will also stand with them. So you have both, and once the protest gets started, the greater participation gets masked by the rhetoric of shared values. You have a lot of that epidictic rhetoric reasserting communal values, reminding people of their communal commitments, their commitments to one another. That helps a protest continue its momentum. And I think we saw that here too, when suffering reaches a boiling point. So the media kind of starts it, right? We hear about individual suffering. These people are organized in unions, so grassroots organizing didn't have to happen in either of these cases. Latent structures were simply activated to bring these protests into being, but at the same time, it's that pending sense of urgency that gets boots on the ground. An immediate sense.
Are there any other questions? Oh, good.
So this is pretty near to my family because my dad is actually an immigration judge. So he was not working during the government shutdown, but how can public sector employees and those that stand in solidarity with them sort of, what can they do in the face of politicians and rhetoric that treats them like they're not full citizens? And how can they sort of fight back against that?
First and foremost, I think, is reinvigorate industrial democracy and social democracy. So that means cleaning up unions a bit, getting them to be more participatory. Some have kind of fallen into bureaucratic slumps, but that can only change if the members show up at meetings and get invested in the issues to have that collective action. I think also that we need to be conscious in conversation with one another of expressing value of public services, right? So, why do I have to pay my taxes? I don't get anything out of it. Do you drive on roads? Do you have kids in your neighborhood or in your life? Would you like to see them hanging out on street corners, or would you like them to be able to go to a library or a park, little kids a park to play to get off energy, right? Thinking about ways that public services can help a community and being sure to speak up in the uncomfortable situation at the Thanksgiving dinner table when Uncle Smith decides to say some really inaccurate or offensive thing, to say, you know, what about this situation? And what value is there that you actually do derive, maybe not directly personally, but to a community, and helping shift that conversation away from individual to communal values. But it also means showing up at local government meetings too. I mean, I have 2 small kids and a husband who works, and I work too. Let's be honest, I don't have time to go for 3 hours to a city council meeting once a week or once a month. It's not part of the reality. But we do have a responsibility to get in touch when we have a chance, even if it's just leaving a voicemail or shooting an email off to our representatives to keep tabs on what's going on. So a lot of it's education, a lot of it's on individual level, but enough individuals, and hopefully the communal structures build. And I don't have a quick answer. I'm sorry. I wish there was a push the red button and everything is better. It takes a lot of work. And that's one of the problems, right? With Wisconsin, it wasn't sustainable for people living their lives. So how do we come up with ways to make it sustainable?
Please bear with me, I've been trying to formulate this question this entire time. So, the way that it seems as though your job works, or what it is that you do, every set of words or every statement that is put into the public eye by any kind of political force, regardless of the forum, is also going to be deconstructed in a sense. And in doing so, it seems as though somebody with your ability is also able to reconstruct what they're trying to say, to put it in a way that would be more like palpable for the general public. And in doing so, we also lose the intention, potentially, like we lose the connotations that you would end up getting from the kinds of words, say, that you were reading earlier. And so I guess I'm just wondering if we have people who have your ability step into the position where they are going to be constructing these words that are put into the public's eye, is there a possibility in the future that we lose the leg up that we get from our ability to deconstruct the intentions from the people who are speaking? Does that make sense?
I think you're asking, kind of, can we get to ivory tower and get too insular in our thinking and too, is that kind of where this is headed? Like, do we take out the power of people to critically think if so much critical thinking has gone into the construction of arguments?
Yes.
Okay, I think it's a fair question to ask, and I think it's also what Integral gives us, right? Because all I've done is look really closely, stared long and hard as my candle burned down to a nub, right? Essentially, at these texts, right? So by thinking hard, do we get rid of the need for others to think hard? And I don't think that that is the case at all. I think that we can continue to advance and make better strides if everybody is asking questions and realizing that maybe the answer I came up with isn't actually an algorithm that can be plugged in and have some machine learning come up with the ideal response that will get maximum adherence, right? That we actually need to question what assumptions were made in my analysis. And I think we're starting to see that a lot with conversations about machine learning and search engines and algorithms being used, thinking that, oh, these intellectuals who know a heck of a lot are trying to come up with better ways to make decisions and come up with outcomes. Essentially doing what you said, deconstructing, reconstructing, deconstructing again. But I think that they're only as good as the people who put them together. And so we need people to keep thinking and putting things together and asking questions and saying, is this good, is it not good? Because it's, I think, in the human that we can answer the good and not good. And in the consequences, in our values, our morals, our ethics, that's where a lot of that comes into play. So I don't think I'm right in everything. I think that these conversations help us shift how we think about how we use these techniques, when it's appropriate to, when it's not. Maybe when it's better to be silent or to speak up. It's good thoughts.
I don't need to chat. So, Kristen, some years ago, maybe 3 to 4 years ago, I think as the result in part of the rhetorical stances adopted regularly by President Obama and the Obama administration, language framed in terms of the common good started to reappear pretty regularly in public discourse, and then disappeared. So that one rarely hears that term used, and when one does hear it, one takes it to be a kind of sop thrown to particular audiences. Right? What's wrong with the public discourse when the common good falls out of it? Is that just a formal lapse, or is that a real lapse? Is there a substitute for that concept and the constructs that follow from that concept, or are we just dealing with a more tribal, a less penetrating, and therefore a more deceiving public discourse?
Yeah, that disappearance is really troubling. Well, and I don't know.
You know where I stand.
Right. Well, I do think we are in a more deceptive, deceiving, awful time for rhetoric right now. I really do. At least the dominant discourse, right? That doesn't mean that the other isn't present, but how do we change that tide? And I mean, going to St. Mary's, enter to learn, leave to serve, I think I did this summer for the common good when I was here. So hearing it in public discourse was really heartening, right? Those same things that we were taught being echoed out in society. Great, St. Mary's mission accomplished, right? Oh, wait, no. It's not so done. It's not a world of bouncing balls, as we talked about in our seminar this morning, right? We haven't gotten rid of the need for discourse. And I think this is where ethics in rhetoric does have a place. What should be said, what should not be said. How do we reinvigorate? I mean, we need freedom of speech because the only way to counter bad speech is with good speech. I do adhere to that. But understanding that speech reflects internally held convictions and values is very troubling when you don't like what's being said and you find it, quite frankly, despicable at times, right? Morally corrupt at times. And how do you respect, not even respectfully, but effectively engage with that to shift minds? Are they a rhetorical audience when you disagree so vehemently, or are you only arguing with them so that people who listen, who maybe are still on the fence, can change their minds? So I think about this a lot. My husband likes to get into arguments with his coworkers, and he holds different political views than them. And I have to remind him, you aren't going to persuade them, And he reminds me, yeah, but other people are listening. And that's really important, I think, in this public dialogue, is we're hearing voices, but But a lot of people are silent, and those are the minds that are up for change often. I can tolerate his arguments better when I keep that in mind, too. When I know he's hitting his head against the wall, right? But I think that scales up, too, and makes us think about what's happening right now. How do we get back to that, and it's changing those minds to the listeners?
There have been some recent victories by public sector employees, particularly led by educators, here in Oakland, Los Angeles, but also in more conservative areas, I think Oklahoma and West Virginia. Do you think that the discourse is turning around a little bit so that the voice of public sector employees is rebounding a little bit? And do you ever see private sector employees following along?
I think it'll be a long time before private sector employees follow along, but yes, I do see that turn as well. And again, it's that local invigoration. And I think knowing it's been reflected at the federal level, and now we're seeing a lot of, well, the teacher stuff started happening beforehand too. I think we do have these tides. My dissertation explored some of the extremes that that pendulum has swung for public sector workers. I think the private sector could only get reinvigorated with a lot of changes, and it might be another crisis because somehow, and I haven't figured out what about it, with the recession, people became more entrenched in the individual instead of engaging in the communal in the private sector and trying to get help by unifying. That didn't happen, right? Jobs are just gone. So how are you going to organize for your job if your job isn't there? Right? So you have to have some resources for organization to happen. And getting that happy point, that golden mean of circumstances, negative circumstances and positive resources, where you have a chance for organization and progress. I don't have the answer for that, but it's not any time on my horizon yet.
I have one other question, if I might, Krista. Some years ago, in a lecture not unlike this one, by some years ago, I mean a long time ago, Joseph Tussman was then professor of politics at the University of California, gave a lecture here on citizenship. And one of the questions that was asked, and if I remember correctly, it might have been asked by Ernest Burchett. One of the questions that was asked was this: can you give us a one-sentence characterization of what it means to be a citizen? And he answered with the following sentence. I want you to comment. A citizen is a person who enters a voting booth and understands him or herself to be a magistrate, to be acting for the whole community, to be a magistrate in the act of voting. It seems to be nearly all the rhetoric you've presented. I'm back to my comment. Nearly all the rhetoric you've presented understands a citizen as a member of an interest group, or a member of a group of people self-defined as oppressed, or self-defined as warding off the incursions of the oppressed, or self-defined in some other adversarial way. So when you speak of the communal and the individual, or revivifying citizenship, or revivifying exactly what? The sense of magistracy that one carries into a voting booth with one, or?
I think that's an excellent thing, and I think you pointed out an issue with how I've been talking about citizenship, because I think the way to get power for citizenship is in uniting in interest groups, but I don't think that's the essence of citizenship. I think when we think about citizenship, we need to think about our responsibility to creating a society that is good for the community, for all citizens. Well, for all people, whether they be citizens or not. And that's a bit more idealistic. And I think it requires social, industrial, and representative democracy to be a full and deep citizenship. So it's not just entering as a magistrate into the voting booth, but it's in how we discuss with others when we have other people who hear us, and in those interpersonal relationships, in that discussion, that is a key part of social democracy, a key part of communal life is engaging in that community. And it's also at our workplaces. We are constrained by laws and we spend much of our days at work. So figuring out how to make that community viable and good, working towards that common good, I think is an essential responsibility of citizenship. And it's a citizenship that's not necessarily 100% aligned with nationalism or national identity, but it is a human sort of citizenship, I would posit. Definitely a bit more idealistic and a lot more work, I think.
Well, before we head to the barbecue and eat as students, debtors, and working citizens with our FAFSA loans paid off, we should thank Dr. Kirsten